In the heart of New York City, where skyscrapers kissed the clouds and life moved at a frenetic pace, there lived a man who had everything money could buy but carried a void no fortune could fill. This was a billionaire, an empire builder, someone who commanded respect in boardrooms and admiration on magazine covers. But today, he wasn't thinking about stocks or deals or profit margins. Today, he walked into an upscale jewelry store with one purpose: to find something special for his late wife's charity gala. The store smelled faintly of polished wood and expensive perfume, its glass cases gleaming under soft lights. The billionaire glanced around, taking in the rows of sparkling diamonds, emeralds, and rubies. Each piece seemed more dazzling than the last, but none caught his attention. His mind wandered as he browsed, drifting back to memories he tried so hard to bury. Memories of a little girl with bright eyes and a laugh that lit up even the darkest days. A daughter who had vanished without a trace 5 years ago, on her 16th birthday. He shook his head, trying to focus. He couldn't let himself get lost in those thoughts again. Not here, not now. But just as he turned away from a display of rings, something stopped him cold. Nestled among other pendants in a velvet-lined case was a necklace that made his breath hitch. It wasn't just any pendant, it was the pendant. The one he'd commissioned specially for his daughter all those years ago. An intricate teardrop-shaped sapphire surrounded by delicate gold filigree, one of a kind, unmistakable. His chest tightened as he stared at it, disbelief warring with hope. How could this be? That pendant was supposed to be gone forever, lost along with her. Unless she was still out there somewhere. Or worse, had someone taken it from her? Questions swirled in his mind, each one heavier than the last. Approached the counter slowly, his steps deliberate but unsteady. The saleswoman behind the desk greeted him with a warm smile, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside him. "Good afternoon," she said cheerfully. "Can I help you with anything?" He hesitated, pointing toward the pendant. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "That necklace, where did it come from?" The woman followed his gaze and nodded knowingly. "Oh, that one. Beautiful piece, isn't it? It came in recently, from a private seller." "A private seller?" he repeated, leaning closer. "Do you know who?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. "Not really. They wanted to remain anonymous. But I do remember the person who brought it in. A man, middle-aged, kind of nervous. He said it was a family heirloom. Nervous. Anonymous. Family heirloom. None of it added up. If this truly was his daughter's pendant, why would someone lie about how they got it? And what did family heirloom even mean? This wasn't some antique passed down through generations. It was custom-made, personal, unique. The billionaire felt a knot forming in his stomach. He needed answers, but first, he needed that pendant. "I'll take it," he said firmly, pulling out his wallet. The saleswoman frowned apologetically. "I'm sorry, sir, but another customer has already reserved it. They're coming back later tonight to finalize the purchase." His jaw tightened. Reserved? By who? Why? Every instinct told him not to walk away, not when this might be his only chance to uncover the truth. "When are they coming?" he asked sharply. "Around 7, she replied, sensing his urgency. "If you'd like, you can wait." He nodded stiffly, knowing he didn't have a choice. Sitting in the plush leather chairs near the entrance, he watched the clock tick by, his mind racing. Images of his daughter flooded his thoughts. The way she used to run into his arms after school, the way she'd twirl in front of the mirror when he gave her the pendant. She promised never to take it off, and he believed her. Until she disappeared. As the hours dragged on, the store grew quieter. Shoppers left, employees tidied up displays, and eventually, only a few people remained. Then, just before 7, the door chimed softly. A man entered, his scruffy appearance standing out against the elegance of the shop. He wore a leather jacket, faded jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Something about him set off alarm bells in the billionaire's head. There was something familiar in the way he moved, in the way he avoided eye contact, The man approached the counter, exchanging quiet words with the saleswoman. When she handed him the pendant, the billionaire stood abruptly, unable to stay seated any longer. He crossed the room in long strides, his presence commanding immediate attention. "That belongs to me," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. The man looked startled, clutching the pendant tightly. "What are you talking about? I paid for this." "You didn't pay for it. You stole it," the billionaire shot back, his tone icy. "Tell me where you got it." For a moment, the man looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders slumped in defeat. Okay, he muttered. "I found it, all right? I don't know whose it is." The billionaire narrowed his eyes. "You expect me to believe that? Do you have any idea what this means to me?" The tension in the air was palpable. Customers and staff alike glanced nervously between the two men, unsure of what might happen next. But the billionaire didn't care. All he cared about was finding out the truth. And if this stranger wouldn't give it willingly, he'd find another way to make him talk. The billionaire's sharp gaze bore into the scruffy man, who shifted uncomfortably under the weight of his stare. The room felt smaller somehow, the air thick with tension. Everyone else in the store seemed to fade into the background as these two men stood locked in a silent battle of wills. The stranger, scruffy and nervous, knew he was cornered. His fingers tightened around the pendant, but it was clear he wasn't going to walk out of there without answering some questions. "Listen," the man stammered, glancing toward the door as if calculating his chances of escape. "I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't steal anything. I already told you. I found it." The billionaire took a step closer, his towering frame making the other man shrink back slightly. "Found it? Where?" he demanded, his voice low, but laced with intensity. "Because that pendant doesn't just show up lying on the street." The man hesitated, clearly torn between lying and coming clean. Finally, he sighed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "All right, fine. I didn't exactly find it. I bought it from a pawn shop, okay, a couple of years ago." "A pawn shop?" the billionaire repeated, his mind racing. Pawn shops were notorious for dealing in stolen goods. If this man had bought it, then someone else must have sold it, someone who might know more about its origins, and maybe even about his daughter. "Which pawn shop?" the billionaire asked, his tone softening slightly but still firm. He needed information, not confrontation. Not yet, anyway. The scruffy man hesitated again, his eyes darting around the room. "Look, I don't want any trouble," he muttered. "I just saw the pendant, thought it looked valuable, and figured I could flip it for a quick buck. That's all." The billionaire clenched his fists at his sides, fighting the urge to grab the man by the collar and shake the truth out of him. But he knew losing his temper wouldn't help. Instead, he leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Tell me where the pawn shop is, or so help me. I'll make sure you regret keeping quiet." For a moment, the man looked like he might resist. Then, realizing he had no real choice, he relented. "It's downtown," he said quickly. "On 8th Street, small place, kinda run down, that's all I know, I swear." The billionaire studied him carefully, searching for any sign of deception. But the man seemed genuinely scared now, his earlier bravado replaced by genuine fear. Still, trust didn't come easily, not when it came to something this important. "Stay here," the billionaire ordered, turning to the saleswoman behind the counter. "Can we use your office for a minute?" The woman nodded nervously, clearly sensing the gravity of the situation. She led them to a small, cluttered office tucked away at the back of the store. Once inside, the billionaire closed the door firmly, shutting out the curious stares of the staff and customers outside. "Now," he said, turning back to the scruffy man, "let's try this again, and this time, don't leave anything out." The man swallowed hard, sinking into one of the chairs. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," the billionaire replied, pulling up another chair and sitting directly across from him. "Start from the beginning. When did you buy it? Who sold it to you? Did they say anything about where it came from?" The man rubbed his temples, looking exhausted. "Like I said, it was a few years ago. I don't remember the exact date. As for who sold it, it was just some guy. Looked like your average Joe. He didn't say much, just handed it over and took the cash." "And you didn't think to ask where he got it?" The billionaire pressed, his frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. The man shrugged defensively. Hey, I'm not exactly in the habit of interrogating people at pawn shops. All I cared about was whether it was worth something. The billionaire leaned back in his chair, letting out a slow breath. This wasn't getting him anywhere fast, but at least he had a lead. A pawn shop on 8th Street. It wasn't much, but it was something. Something tangible. Something he could follow. What about the pawn shop owner? He asked after a moment. Did they mention anything about the pendant? Like how long it had been there or who brought it in? The scruffy man shook his head. Not really. I mean, the guy behind the counter didn't seem too interested in it. Just waited, gave me a price, and that was that. The billionaire frowned. Pawn shop owners weren't known for their curiosity, but surely someone selling a piece like this would raise eyebrows. Unless they'd gone out of their way to avoid drawing attention. Maybe the seller had been careful. Too careful. Think hard, the billionaire urged. Is there anything else you can tell me? Anything at all? The man hesitated, then added reluctantly. There was one thing. The guy who sold it. He looked kind of shady, like he didn't want to be seen, kept his hat pulled down low, you know, and he paid in cash. Cash transactions were common in places like pawn shops, but combined with everything else, it only deepened the billionaire's suspicions. Whoever had sold the pendant hadn't wanted to leave a trail, which meant they had something to hide. All right, the billionaire said finally, standing up. You've been helpful, for now. The scruffy man looked relieved, thinking the ordeal was over. But the billionaire wasn't done yet. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of bills, peeling off several $100 notes. Here, he said, tossing the money onto the desk. Consider this payment for your cooperation. But if you breathe a word of this to anyone at all, you'll regret it. The man stared at the cash wide-eyed. You don't have to worry about that, he mumbled, scooping it up quickly. I won't say anything. Good, the billionaire replied, opening the door. Because I'll be watching. Back in the main part of the store, the billionaire paused for a moment, collecting his thoughts. He had a nameless pawn shop and a vague description of a suspicious seller. It wasn't much, but it was more than he'd had hours ago. More importantly, it gave him hope, a fragile, flickering hope, that he might finally be closing in on answers, as he stepped out onto the bustling city street. The noise and chaos of New York enveloped him once again, but he barely noticed. His mind was already racing ahead, planning his next move. Because somewhere out there, hidden in the shadows of this sprawling metropolis, lay the truth about his daughter, and he wasn't going to stop until he found it. The billionaire stood outside the jewelry store for a moment, letting the cool evening air wash over him. The city buzzed around him, cars honking, people chatting, the distant hum of life moving on as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But for him, everything had changed. That tiny pendant, no bigger than the palm of his hand, had reignited a fire he thought had burned out years ago. It wasn't just a piece of jewelry. It was a thread, however fragile, connecting him to the daughter he'd lost. He glanced at his watch. Time was slipping away, but he couldn't afford to waste a second. Every hour that passed could mean another lead going cold. He hailed a cab and gave the driver the address. 8th Street, the pawn shop, his next stop. As the cab wove through traffic, his mind raced. What would he find there? Would the owner remember the pendant? And if they did, would they be willing to talk? Pawn shops weren't exactly known for their transparency. People went there to sell things without questions asked, and often for reasons they didn't want anyone digging into. Still, he had to try. For her. When the cab pulled up to the curb, he stepped out and took in the scene. The pawn shop was exactly as described, small, dingy, and tucked between a laundromat and a cheap diner. Its sign flickered weakly above the door, casting an uneven glow onto the cracked sidewalk. Inside, the shop smelled like old metal and dust, its shelves cluttered with odds and ends. Broken watches, chipped china, mismatched silverware. A bell jingled softly as he entered, announcing his presence. Behind the counter sat a wiry man in his 50s, slouched on a stool with a cigarette dangling from his lips. His shirt was stained and his greasy hair stuck to his forehead. He looked up lazily when the billionaire walked in, clearly not expecting anyone important to darken his doorstep. "Can I help you?" the man drawled, his voice rough and uninterested. "I'm looking for information," the billionaire replied, stepping closer. His tone was calm but firm, the kind that demanded attention whether the listener wanted to give it or not. The pawnbroker raised an eyebrow. "Information about what?" "A pendant. A sapphire necklace. Someone brought it in here a few years ago." The man's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted, a flicker of recognition, maybe even unease. He leaned back slightly, exhaling a cloud of smoke. "Don't know what you're talking about." The billionaire wasn't surprised. Denial was practically part of the job description for someone in this line of work, but he wasn't about to let the man off the hook so easily. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photo of the pendant, the same one he'd shown the scruffy seller earlier. He slid it across the counter. "This," he said, tapping the picture. "Someone sold it here. I need to know who." The pawnbroker glanced at the photo briefly before pushing it back toward him. "Look, buddy, we get a lot of stuff in here. Can't keep track of every little trinket." The billionaire studied him carefully, noting the way his fingers twitched nervously against the countertop. This guy knew something. He was sure of it, but prying it out of him wouldn't be easy. "Let me make this clear," he said, leaning in closer. His voice dropped lower, quieter, but carried a weight that made the pawnbroker sit up straighter. "This isn't just some random piece of jewelry, it's personal, very personal, and I'm not leaving until I get answers." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, neither blinking nor backing down. Finally, the pawnbroker sighed, stubbing out his cigarette in an ashtray overflowing with butts. All right, he muttered, holding up his hands in surrender. "I might have seen something similar, but I can't promise anything." "Start talking," the billionaire urged, pulling up a stool and sitting directly across from him. If this guy was going to drag it out, fine, but he wasn't walking away empty-handed. The pawnbroker hesitated, scratching at a stain on his shirt. "It was a while back, 3, maybe 4 years ago. Some kid came in selling a bunch of stuff, clothes, electronics, that kind of thing. Said she needed cash quick." His words hit the billionaire like a punch to the gut. A kid? Selling a custom-made pendant worth thousands for pocket change? That didn't add up unless she'd been desperate. Or scared. "What did she look like?" he asked, his voice tight, despite his best efforts to stay composed. The pawnbroker shrugged. "Young. Teenager, probably. Looked like she hadn't slept in days. Kept glancing over her shoulder like she was worried someone was following her." The billionaire felt a chill run down his spine. Scared. Alone. Just like she must have been when she disappeared. Was it possible she'd ended up here trying to scrape together enough money to survive? Or had someone forced her to sell it? "Did she say anything else?" he pressed. "Anything at all?" The pawnbroker shook his head. "Not much, just mumbled something about needing to leave town. Paid in cash, grabbed the money, and bolted." "Leave town? Where would she go and why?" Questions swirled in his mind, each one more urgent than the last, but there was one detail he couldn't ignore. "She came in alone?" he asked. The pawnbroker hesitated again, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, alone. At least I think so. Though," he trailed off, his brow furrowing as if recalling something unpleasant. "Though what?" the billionaire prompted, leaning forward. "There was a guy," the pawnbroker admitted reluctantly, hung back near the door while she did the deal. Big guy, looked shady. Didn't say a word, just kept watching her like a hawk. A muscle in the billionaire's jaw twitched. So she hadn't been alone after all. Whoever that man was, he clearly played a role in this story, a role the billionaire intended to uncover. "Do you remember anything else about him?" he asked, though he already knew the answer would disappoint him. "Nothing specific," the pawnbroker replied with a shrug. "Just bad vibes, you know? Like trouble following him wherever he went." Bad vibes. Trouble. None of it painted. a comforting picture. But it gave him a direction to move in. Somewhere out there, this man existed. And if he found him, he might finally find her. The billionaire stood up, fishing a thick roll of cash from his pocket. He peeled off several $100 bills and placed them on the counter. "Thanks for your time," he said simply, turning to leave. "Hey," the pawnbroker called after him, gesturing toward the money. "What's this for?" "For keeping quiet," the billionaire replied without looking back. "And for remembering more details if I come back." Outside, the night air felt heavier than before. Each new revelation only deepened the mystery, pulling him further into a web of uncertainty. Yet amid the chaos of unanswered questions, one thing remained crystal clear. He was closer now than he'd ever been. Closer to finding her. Closer to the truth. And he wasn't stopping. Not until he had both. The billionaire stepped out of the pawn shop, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. The image of a scared teenage girl selling her most prized possession haunted him. Was it really her? Could it be possible that she'd ended up in such a grim place? And who was the man lurking by the door, watching her like prey? Every detail he uncovered only deepened the mystery, but it also fueled his determination. He couldn't afford to lose focus now, not when answers were finally within reach. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through old photos, stopping at one that made his chest tighten. It was taken on her 16th birthday, the last time he saw her smiling face. She wore the pendant proudly, her eyes gleaming with happiness. That day had started with laughter and celebration, but it ended in unimaginable heartbreak. Now, years later, pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but each piece brought more questions than answers. Determined to chase the next lead, he dialed a number he hadn't used in months. On the third ring, a gruff voice answered. "Yeah?" "It's me," the billionaire said. "I need your help." There was a pause on the other end before the voice replied. "You serious?" "Thought you swore off this kind of thing." "I did," he admitted, "but things have changed. I think I'm close to finding her." Another pause, longer this time, then, "All right, meet me at the usual spot in an hour." An hour later, the billionaire sat in a dimly lit diner, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The place smelled faintly of burnt coffee and stale fries, its cracked vinyl booths worn from decades of use. Across from him sat a man who looked like he belonged in a noir movie. A trench coat draped over broad shoulders, a fedora pulled low over his forehead. This wasn't just anyone. It was someone who knew how to dig up secrets others wanted buried. Someone who could navigate the shadows where truth went to hide. "You're sure about this?" the man asked, stirring sugar into his coffee without looking up. "Last time you got involved in something like this, it nearly destroyed you." The billionaire clenched his fists under the table. He didn't need reminders of what losing her had done to him, or how far he'd fallen trying to find her. But this time felt different. This time, he had real leads. Real hope. "I'm sure," he said firmly. "I've got a description of a guy connected to the pendant. Shady character, big build, hangs around kids who look like they're in trouble. Sound familiar?" The man sipped his coffee thoughtfully, then nodded. "Could be anybody, but yeah, I've seen types like that before. Usually tied to some low-level operation. Drugs, trafficking, that sort of thing. If your girl crossed paths with someone like him..." He trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. The billionaire's stomach churned at the thought. Trafficking. Drugs. None of it painted a comforting picture, but he couldn't let fear stop him. "Not now." "Can you track him down?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. The man smirked faintly. "For you? Sure. But it won't be cheap." Money had never been an issue for him. He slid an envelope across the table, thick with cash. "This is just the start. There's more if you deliver." The man glanced at the envelope, then back at the billionaire. For a moment, there was a flicker of respect in his eyes. "All right," he said, tucking the envelope into his coat. "Give me 48 hours. I'll see what I can find." As the days passed, the billionaire found himself pacing relentlessly. unable to sit still. Every knock on the door or buzz of his phone sent his heart racing. He hated waiting, hated feeling powerless, but he forced himself to stay patient, knowing that rushing things could jeopardize everything. Finally, on the second night, his phone rang. It was the man in the trench coat. "We might have something," came the gravelly voice on the other end. "Meet me at the docks. Midnight." The docks. Even hearing the word sent a shiver down his spine. They were notorious for being dangerous after dark, a haven for criminals and lost souls alike. But he didn't hesitate. Grabbing his coat, he headed out into the cold night. When he arrived, the area was eerily silent except for the gentle lapping of water against the wooden pylons. Fog rolled in from the river, shrouding everything in a ghostly haze. The man in the trench coat stood near a stack of crates, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. "What do you have?" the billionaire asked, cutting straight to the point. The man gestured toward a shadowy figure leaning against a lamppost a short distance away. "That's him. Matches the description you gave me." The billionaire squinted, studying the man carefully. He was tall and muscular, with a menacing presence that matched the pawnbroker's account perfectly. His arms were crossed and he scanned the area with sharp, calculating eyes. Clearly, he wasn't someone to mess with lightly. "Who is he?" the billionaire whispered. "Name's Ray Dempsey," the man replied. "Small-time crook, mostly muscle for hire. Word is he works for someone higher up, but nobody knows who. He's careful, keeps his head down, doesn't ask questions." The billionaire's jaw tightened. Careful or not, this man held answers. Answers he desperately needed. "What about the girl?" he pressed. "Did you find anything on her?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "No solid leads yet, but Dempsey's been spotted hanging around abandoned warehouses lately. Might be worth checking out." Abandoned warehouses. The idea sent a chill down his spine. What if she was there? What if she'd been trapped somewhere all these years? "Thanks," the billionaire said quietly, pulling out another envelope of cash. "Keep digging. Let me know if you find anything else." The man nodded, pocketing the money. "Be careful," he warned. "Guys like Dempsey don't take kindly to nosy visitors." Back in his car, the billionaire stared at the warehouse district looming in the distance. Somewhere in those crumbling buildings, the truth waited. He could feel it. But getting to it wouldn't be easy. Ray Dempsey wasn't going to talk willingly, and even if he did, there was no guarantee he'd tell the truth. Still, he couldn't turn back now, not when he was so close. Pulling out his phone, he made one final call. "I need backup," he said simply. "And weapons. We're going in tonight." The billionaire sat in his car, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he stared at the warehouse district ahead. The area was a maze of crumbling brick buildings, broken windows, and rusted metal doors. It felt like a ghost town, but he knew better. Places like this didn't stay empty for long. They became hiding spots for people who preferred the shadows to the light. And somewhere in those shadows, he believed, was the man who might lead him to his daughter. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard. Midnight had come and gone, but the night was still young for someone like Ray Dempsey. Criminals didn't keep regular hours. They thrived in darkness, moving unseen while the rest of the world slept. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. This wasn't just about finding answers anymore. It was about confronting the fear that had haunted him for years. Fear of what might have happened to her. Fear of never seeing her again. His phone buzzed on the passenger seat, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was the backup he'd called earlier, a trusted ally who worked off the books, someone who understood how to handle dangerous situations without asking too many questions. "I'm here," came the voice on the other end, low and calm. "Where do you want me?" "Warehouse 12, the billionaire replied, his eyes scanning the row of numbered structures. "Park 2 blocks away and come in quietly. We don't need any surprises." "Got it," the voice said before hanging up. The billionaire exhaled, slowly, his mind racing through the plan. He couldn't afford to make mistakes, not when so much was at stake. But planning could only take him so far. When you stepped into the lion's den, instincts mattered more than strategies. And right now every instinct screamed at him to move forward. 20 minutes later, the two men met near the entrance of Warehouse 12. The ally was tall and lean, dressed entirely in black with a hood pulled low over his face. In one hand he carried a flashlight, in the other a small handgun tucked discreetly into his jacket pocket. Neither man spoke as they approached the building, their footsteps muffled by the damp pavement. The door creaked loudly as the billionaire pushed it open, revealing a cavernous space filled with debris, broken furniture, piles of old crates, and scraps of metal scattered across the floor. The air smelled musty, like decades of neglect had soaked into the walls. Somewhere in the distance, water dripped steadily, echoing through the silence. "Split up?" the ally whispered, glancing around cautiously. "No," the billionaire replied firmly. "We stick together. If Dempsey's here, we'll find him faster working as a team." They moved deeper into the warehouse, their flashlights cutting narrow paths through the darkness. Every sound, their footsteps, the occasional groan of shifting wood, felt amplified in the oppressive quiet. The tension was palpable, pressing down on them like a weight. They both knew that if Dempsey was inside, they weren't the only ones looking for trouble. Suddenly, a faint noise caught their attention, a shuffle, followed by the unmistakable click of a lighter igniting. The billionaire froze, raising a bound hand to signal his partner to stop. Slowly, they crept toward the source of the sound, their movements deliberate and silent. Around a stack of crates, they found him. Ray Dempsey sat slouched against a wall, smoking a cigarette. His bulky frame looked even larger in the dim light, and his expression was unreadable behind the haze of smoke swirling around him. For a moment, no one moved. Then Dempsey noticed them. "Well, well," he drawled, flicking ash onto the floor. "Look who decided to crash my party." The billionaire stepped forward, his voice cold and steady. "We need to talk." Dempsey chuckled darkly, leaning back against the wall as if he didn't have a care in the world. "Talk? About what? You lost, pal?" "You know why I'm here," the billionaire shot back, taking another step closer. "The pendant, the girl, start talking." At the mention of the pendant, something flickered in Dempsey's eyes, a mix of recognition and unease. He stood up slowly, towering over the two men but making no sudden moves. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. The billionaire wasn't buying it. "Don't play dumb," he snapped. "You've been seen with her. A teenage girl, scared, alone. Where is she?" For a moment, Dempsey hesitated, then shrugged dismissively. "Yeah, okay, maybe I saw her once, so what? She ain't my problem." That was all the billionaire needed to hear. In 2 quick strides, he closed the distance between them, grabbing Dempsey by the collar. "Listen to me," he growled, his voice dripping with fury. "If you know anything about her, if you've done anything to hurt her, you'll regret it." Dempsey raised his hands defensively, clearly startled by the sudden aggression. "Whoa, whoa. Easy there, boss. I didn't touch her, all right?" "I swear." "Then tell me where she is," the billionaire demanded, his grip tightening. All right, Dempsey stammered, panic creeping into his voice. She was with me for a while, yeah. But not by choice. Someone else brought her in. Paid me to keep an eye on her for a few days." "Who?" the billionaire pressed, shaking him slightly. "Who paid you?" Dempsey swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the ally standing nearby. I don't know his name. Never met him before. Just got instructions over the phone. Big guy. Lots of cash. Said he'd kill me if I talked." The billionaire's heart sank. Another dead, and another shadowy figure pulling strings from the darkness. But Dempsey wasn't finished yet. He wanted her kept out of sight, Dempsey continued hurriedly, desperate to cooperate now that he realized the billionaire wasn't bluffing. Said she'd caused some trouble, and he needed time to figure out what to do with her. "What kind of trouble?" the billionaire asked sharply. "I don't know," Dempsey exclaimed. "Something about stealing something or running away, maybe. I wasn't supposed to ask questions, all right? I just did what I was told." And where is she now? The billionaire demanded, his patience wearing thin. Dempsey hesitated again, then sighed. I don't know exactly. After a couple of weeks, things went sideways. The guy stopped calling, stopped showing up. I panicked and dumped her in a cabin outside the city. Left her food, water, all that. Told her to stay put until someone came for her. The billionaire's blood ran cold. A cabin, out in the middle of nowhere. How long had she been there? Was she still alive? Where's the cabin? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Dempsey rattled off vague directions, describing a remote spot deep in the woods. It's old, falling apart, he added. But it's all I can give you. The billionaire released him, stepping back as the reality of the situation hit him like a freight train. She was out there, alone, possibly scared, possibly hurt, but alive, at least he prayed she was. Turning to his ally, he said grimly, "Let's go." As they left the warehouse, the billionaire felt a strange mix of emotions swirling inside him. Relief that he finally had a solid lead. Anger at the people who had taken her away from him. And fear, raw, unrelenting fear that he might be too late. But he couldn't let himself think like that. Not now. Not when she was so close. Clutching the directions tightly in his hand, he climbed into the car, his mind focused on one thing and one thing only: bringing her home. The drive to the cabin felt endless. Every mile stretched longer than the last, the winding roads through dense forests doing little to ease the billionaire's racing mind. The car's headlights cut narrow beams into the darkness, illuminating gnarled trees and patches of fog that clung to the ground like ghosts. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, his grip so tight it ached. Beside him, his ally sat silently, occasionally glancing at the map they'd scrawled on a scrap of paper based on Dempsey's vague directions. Neither man spoke much during the journey. There wasn't much to say. The billionaire's thoughts were consumed by images of her, his daughter, as she might be now. Would she recognize him? Would she even remember him after all these years? Or had the pain and fear erased those memories, leaving behind only scars? Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the edge of the woods where Dempsey said the cabin was hidden. The billionaire parked the car on a narrow dirt path, its tires crunching softly against gravel. Ahead lay nothing but shadows and trees, their branches twisting eerily in the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy above. "We'll have to go on foot from here," he said quietly, grabbing a flashlight and a small backpack filled with supplies. Water, blankets, food. He didn't know what condition she'd be in, but he wanted to be prepared for anything. His ally nodded, pulling up the hood of his jacket as they stepped out of the car. The air was cold and damp, carrying the earthy scent of moss and decaying leaves. They moved cautiously, their flashlights sweeping across the forest floor as they navigated deeper into the wilderness. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves made them freeze, listening intently for signs of movement. After nearly 20 minutes of walking, they spotted it, a dilapidated wooden structure barely visible through the trees. It looked abandoned, its roof sagging under years of neglect, its windows boarded up haphazardly. Weeds grew thick around the foundation, swallowing the place whole. The billionaire stopped short, his breath catching in his throat. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. But as he stared at the crumbling cabin, doubt crept in. What if she wasn't there? What if they were too late? He pushed the thought aside, forcing himself to focus. "Stay close," he whispered to his ally before stepping forward. The wooden steps creaked loudly beneath his weight as he approached the door. For a moment he hesitated, his hand hovering over the handle. Then, taking a deep breath, he pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale and heavy, laced with the smell of mildew and dust. The beam of his flashlight revealed a sparse interior, a rickety table, a single chair overturned on the floor, and a thin mattress shoved into one corner. At first glance, it seemed empty, abandoned. Hope flickered dangerously low. And then, he heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, breathing, slow and uneven, coming from somewhere near the back of the room. His heart leapt into his throat. He turned the flashlight toward the source, his hands trembling slightly as the light fell upon a figure huddled on the mattress. She was wrapped in an old blanket, her face pale and gaunt, her hair matted and tangled. Her eyes were closed, but she stirred weakly at the sudden intrusion. "Hey," he called out softly, lowering the flashlight so the beam wouldn't blind her. "It's okay. You're safe." She blinked slowly, her eyelids fluttering as if struggling to focus. When her gaze finally landed on him, confusion clouded her expression. "Who?" she croaked, her voice hoarse from disuse. Tears welled up in his eyes as he knelt beside her, reaching out tentatively. "It's me," he said, his voice breaking. "Dad." For a moment, she just stared at him, uncomprehending. Then recognition dawned, a flicker of something familiar in her tired eyes. "Dad?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He nodded, choking back sobs as he pulled her gently into his arms. She felt fragile, like she might break if he held her too tightly. But she clung to him nonetheless, her frail body shaking with quiet sobs. "I thought I'd never see you again," she murmured against his chest, her words muffled but full of emotion. "You're not alone anymore," he promised, stroking her hair. "I'm here now. We'll get through this together." Behind them, his ally stood silently, giving them space while keeping watch for any potential threats. The billionaire barely noticed. All that mattered in that moment was the girl in his arms, the daughter he'd spent 5 agonizing years searching for. As the initial shock wore off, he helped her sit up, wrapping the blanket more securely around her shoulders. "Can you walk?" he asked gently. She nodded weakly, though her legs wobbled when she tried to stand. Together, he and his ally supported her as they made their way back to the car. Each step was slow and uncertain, but she didn't complain. Instead, she leaned into him, drawing strength from his presence. Once they reached the vehicle, he settled her carefully into the passenger seat, tucking another blanket around her to ward off the chill. Her eyes drifted shut almost immediately, exhaustion overtaking her. He watched her sleep, marveling at how close he'd come to losing her forever. The ride back to the city was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional murmur between him and his ally. As dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, the billionaire allowed himself a rare moment of peace. They weren't out of the woods yet, not completely. There would be questions to answer, justice to seek, wounds to heal. But for the first time in years, he felt hope. Real, tangible hope. When they finally arrived home, he carried her inside, laying her gently on a bed he'd prepared in advance. Sitting beside her, he clasped her hand in his, unwilling to let go. She stirred briefly, opening her eyes just enough to look at him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He smiled through tears, squeezing her hand gently. "No, sweetheart. Thank you for holding on, for coming back to me." Outside, the world continued to turn, oblivious to the miracle that had unfolded within those walls. But inside, 2 hearts began to mend, bound together once more by love and resilience. And though the road ahead would be long and difficult, they faced it together with hope lighting the way.